More of that damn chanting, more of those death, carts creaking over the cobblestones. You big, two-legged creatures with brains that clearly ain't kept pace with your size. Me, just a common black rat you folks love to scorn, trying to gnaw on a crust of moldy bread in some stinking, dark corner where the stench of death itself has become the damn air we breathe. But those chaotic noises out there ain't just the usual misery of this dying city of Florence. They're a signal, a prelude to another one of your purges. Another fit of fury aimed straight at our miserable kind. Your quack doctors, your useless leaders, they're all screeching rat. Again, like it's some magic word to ward off their own fear. They say we brought this black death, this plague that's turning Europe into one giant graveyard. And so, they're waving torches again, setting traps, siccing dogs on us in every nook and cranny. You'd think after all those rat falls, my own kin, mind you, dropping dead from this very sickness, you people would catch on to something. But no, your brand of ignorance seems to be bottomless. This time, before death himself comes knocking at my dark hole, I wonder, will I even get a chance to file a detailed report on this goddamn ultimate injustice? If that last perspective, the voice of a tiny creature amidst a historic plague, resonated with you in some way, I'd love for you to let me know with a simple like. It truly means a lot and helps unique narratives like this find their way to more people. And if you're curious to fully explore the worldview of this unexpectedly astute rat, his sharp reflections, a centuries-old injustice, and the struggle for survival in a Europe sinking under the Black Death, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications. Together, we'll turn the pages of this dramatic Rodents Chronicle, where history's forgotten voices speak from the darkest corners. Imagine hearing an indictment, both sarcastic and deeply poignant, a perspective often overlooked by the history books. This journey promises to make you rethink many things. I'd genuinely love to know, where are you listening to this from, and what's the atmosphere around you right now? Share in the comments below. It's always fascinating to see from where we're all connecting. Don't look away, the story is only just beginning. Part 1. Have you ever wondered what history would sound like if it were told from the perspective of the ultimate underdog, a creature usually forgotten beneath the feet of great monuments? Today, we're not talking about kings or epic battles. Instead, we're diving deep into one of humanity's darkest chapters, the Black Death, but through the eyes of a witness no one would ever expect, a sewer rat. That's right, a rat. Sounds peculiar, perhaps, but imagine a voice echoing from the shadows of the 14th century, a squeak filled with sarcasm, lament, yet astonishing shrewdness, recounting the miserable life of a rat amidst the plague, a creature not only dying like flies from the very disease humans blamed it for, but also enduring their ignorance, their cruelty, and an unjust sentence that has lasted for centuries. In this video, we're going to dissect a unique script idea together, the Rodents Chronicle, a fictional tale rooted in very real grievances. I'll share with you how a seemingly crazy concept like this can become a powerful piece of storytelling, touching on profound themes of truth, prejudice, and the voice of the oppressed. We'll explore how to build an unlikely anti-hero, craft devastating conflicts, and how the own of a kind voice of a rat can actually captivate an audience from start to finish. Because, ladies and gentlemen, sometimes the greatest stories are found in the darkest and most unexpected places. And the storytelling lessons we can draw from this might just change the way you think about creating content. So, settle in, prepare yourselves, because we're about to step into a world where even death himself shakes his head in exasperation. Ready? Hot Part 1. The shadow of the past and harsh reality. The smell. That was the first thing that woke me each morning, if you could call the dim, grayish light filtering through the cracks of rotten planks. Morning. Not the familiar musty odor of this ragged den, nor the rich reek of the sewer blended with the aroma of spoiled leftovers, things a discerning black rat like myself once considered the flavors of life. No, this was a different scent. A sickly sweet, acrid stench, the smell of putrescence in bloom, the smell of unburied death, the smell of despair, so thick it had condensed into an invisible fog blanketing this miserable city of Florence. I, Squeak the First, an unwilling resident of this benighted 14th century, tried to stretch my emaciated frame, bones creaked in protest. My empty gut, needless to say, was raising a ruckus louder than any mob of paupers clamoring for bread in the piazza. After days of gnawing on nothing but air and curses, which I believe must have some caloric value, considering how endlessly you two-legged spew them, I'd lucked into a crust of bread so dry and hard it felt like one of the pebbles your brats enjoy winging at us for sport. At least it's something, I muttered, teeth grinding as I tried to soften this treasure. In times when even death himself is overworked to the point of forgetting his own schedule, a piece of bread, however moldy, is something to be thankful for. But even as my stomach was momentarily placated, curiosity, that damn instinct that had so often landed my kind in predicaments both hilarious and tragic, began to stir. Outside, the death cart still creaked with the regularity of a dirge that never ended. The mournful drone of prayers mingled with wails of grief. And then there were the sharp screams, the furious curses. You two-leggeds, when frightened, become astonishingly noisy. I hadn't planned on going out truly. This dark corner, however foul and damp, was at least a relatively safe haven. Safer, by far, than streets choked with the miasma of death and the crazed eyes of humans seeking a scapegoat. But a strange sound reached my ears. Not a cry, not a moan, not even a curse. It was a rustle. A very faint, very weak rustle, yet it carried a familiarity that was heartbreaking. The sound of my own kind. Damn it. I cursed under my breath. There goes my rat conscience, inconvenient as always. My belly said stay put, but my ears and nose urged me onward. And as usual, curiosity and something one might call kinship. Though I'm not sure we rats indulge in such luxuries one out. I took a deep breath, trying to filter out the worst of the death, stench, then cautiously squeezed through a narrow gap in the decaying wooden wall. Outside, the daylight was weaker than a dying man's hope. The sky was an oppressive gray shroud. The air was so thick you could slice it with a knife, and the first sight that met my eyes, even after becoming so accustomed to death, still made the fur on my nape stand on end. Human corpses. They lay strewn about, tangled like puppets with their strings cut. Old, young, men, women. Some still in decent clothes, as if death had ambushed them. Others were contorted, disfigured, with a horrifying, swollen buboes on their necks, in their armpits, in their groins, the tell-tale marks of the Black Death. And among these human remains were smaller, furrier bodies, black or gray. My kin. They lay there, silent, alone, a forgotten, collateral damage. A few had died right next to a scraps of food they'd been trying to scrounge. Others were curled up, as if trying to fight off some terrible agony. This, then, was the reign of dead rats, that a few of the more observant, or perhaps just overly fearful humans had noted. Only, no one gave a damn about this particular reign. Our suffering was too insignificant compared to your grand human tragedy. I approached a young rat's corpse. Its fur was still soft, but its eyes were wide, lifeless. Beside it, a larger female, perhaps its mother, also lay still, her body partially shielding her offspring. A poignant scene that none of your poets would likely deign to describe. Because why? Because we are only rats. Anger, an emotion I thought had long since been blunted by countless near-death experiences, began to smolder. Not anger at the Black Death, that was an invisible force, a calamity striking without discrimination. I was angry with you two-leggeds. Angry at your ignorance, your indifference, and above all, your cowardly blame shifting. Just then, the faint rustling sounded again, clearer this time. It came from a pile of rags nearby, where a woman had perhaps just breathed her last. I moved cautiously, ears twitching, nose testing the air. No scent of cats, no sign of hunting dogs. And then I saw it, a tiny mouse, so small, its fur a dusty gray, trembling as it clung to the edge of the cloth. Its eyes were wide with terror, staring right at me. It was too young to understand what was happening, too weak to forage for itself. Its mother was likely one of the corpses nearby. I froze. Part of me wanted to leave. A youngling, in these times, was a burden. I could barely fend for myself. But another part, that damn rat conscience, held me back. The little mouse's eyes, they were just like the eyes of my own young, I'd lost in previous plagues, or to your cruel traps. Damn it all. I muttered again, but this time the exasperation was gone. I slowly approached, trying not to frighten the little one. It cringed, but didn't run. Perhaps it was too weak, or perhaps, in its desperation, it sensed I wasn't a threat. Hey, Squirt. I sniffed softly, a language only rats understand. This area isn't safe. Follow me. I didn't wait for an answer. I turned, heading towards a familiar passage leading into the sewer system, the only place offering a sliver of hope for survival in this dying city. A moment later, I heard tiny, scuttling footsteps detres de me, and so, my unwilling journey, a journey not just to find food for myself, but to protect a tiny, fragile life had begun. And I had a bad feeling that it wouldn't be easy, because, aside from the Black Death hanging over our heads, there was something far more terrifying awaiting us: the stupidity and brutality of humankind. Florence's sewer system, a damp, dark, and stinking labyrinth, was probably hell to you two-leggeds. But to us, the rat kind, it was a kingdom, a sanctuary, a secret network of thoroughfares. Of course, it had its own dangers: lurking feral cats, forgotten traps, and occasionally, sudden floods. But compared to what was happening Fator's ground, this place was practically paradise. I led the little mouse, whom I decided to temporarily call Grafer, through familiar tunnels. He stuck close to my heels, occasionally stumbling over loose stones. I had to slow my pace, a rare display of patience for an old rat like me. Perhaps having a small creature dependent on me had awakened some dormant spark of kindness in my hardship-hardened nature. Keep up, Grafer. I sniffed encouragement when he nearly tumbled again. This world ain't for the weak. My destination was the main market. Though it had become a place of death above ground, below, in its cellars and drains, there might still be some scraps of food left. Humans, in their panic, often discarded things haphazardly, and their carelessness was our opportunity. As we neared the area beneath the market, the miasma of death grew even stronger, mingling with the smell of rotten fish, decaying vegetables, and a strange, acrid, burnt odor. I signaled Grafer to stop, then carefully climbed up to a crack in a wall to observe. The market, once bustling with buyers and sellers, was now eerily silent. Only empty stalls, piles of refuse, and scattered corpses remained. A few wary, listless guards patrolled. Their spears held double sellers as if they could pierce the Black Death itself. And in one corner, a small crowd had gathered, surrounding a man in a dark robe, likely a priest or some sort of physician. He was pontificating grandly, gesturing wildly. I strained to listen. His voice was sonorous, full of false confidence. It is them, the filthy rats. They brought this pestilence from the east, sowing disaster upon this holy city. God is punishing us for tolerating these creatures of the devil. We must exterminate them. Root them out. Burn their nests, fill their burrows, kill every last one. The crowd below nodded dirty-bawed in agreement. A few even shouted vile curses. Their gaunt, desperate faces now shone with a terrifying fanaticism. They had found a tangible enemy to vent their anger upon, a simple explanation for a catastrophe beyond their comprehension. And that enemy, of course, was us. My blood boiled. This injustice, this ignorance, it was crueler than the plague itself. We too were dying from this damned sickness, dying in numbers no less than yours. The bodies of my kin lay everywhere. Wasn't that the clearest proof? But no, you didn't want to see, or deliberately chose not to. Blaming a rat was far easier than admitting that your own filthy lifestyles, your overcrowded, unsanitary cities, had invited this calamity. I bared my teeth. If I could, I would have leaped out there and torn out that black-robed bastard's venomous tongue. But I knew it would be suicide. A lone rat couldn't fight an entire crazed mob. I could only watch from the darkness, witnessing the folly of a species digging its own grave, and ours along with it. Suddenly, Grafer nudged my leg. He was trembling, his tiny eyes pleading. Perhaps he sensed my anger, or perhaps he was frightened by the shouts from the crowd. I took a deep breath, trying to suppress my rage. This was not the time for anger. This was the time for survival. "It's all right, kid." I sniffed, trying to keep my voice calm. "Those fools are just barking. We'll find another way." I slipped back down from the crack, leading Grafer deeper underground. But the words of that black-robed man still echoed in my head. A massive rat extermination campaign was imminent. Our lives, already so fragile, were about to become even more perilous. We continued in silence, palavras our way through the labyrinthine sewers. I tried to find signs of food, a dropped piece of cheese, a few spilled grains, or even a fat insect. But it seemed the Black Death had not only claimed human lives, but also dwindled our meager sources of sustenance. After a fruitless search, I decided to rest in a relatively dry alcove. Grayfur, exhausted, curled up and fell asleep almost immediately. I sat there, on guard, my mind racing. How were we to survive these coming days? How could I protect Grayfur? And more importantly, how could I make those two-leggeds understand the truth? A question that perhaps even the wisest of my rat ancestors couldn't answer. I remembered the stories my mother used to tell, a tales passed down through generations of our kind. That in distant India and Cathay, when rats began to die en masse, it was a sign for humans to pack up and flee. There, our deaths were a warning. Here, in civilized Europe, our deaths were merely an excuse for your slaughter. The irony was as bitter as gall. Even your so-called wise men like Giovanni Boccaccio, who so vividly described the piles of human dead in these very streets of Florence, made no mention of our tragic fate. You were too preoccupied with your own suffering, or perhaps you simply didn't consider us worthy of notice. We, the rats, should have been your canaries in the coal mine. Our mass deaths should have been an early alarm. But you chose to cover your ears. Grayfur's soft snores pulled me from my reverie. Watching him sleep, a rare moment of peace amidst the chaos, I felt a heavy weight of responsibility. I couldn't abandon him. No matter how difficult, I had to find a way to survive, at least until he was old enough to fend for himself. And so, I decided I had to seek out the council of rat elders. Perhaps those old, seasoned rats, survivors of countless plagues and human pogroms, would have a plan. Or at least, they might offer some advice, however useless. In this situation, a sliver of hope, however faint, was better than none at all. I gently nudged Grayfur awake. Come on, kid. We've got a long way to go. And so, two small, dark shadows resumed their uncertain journey through the oppressive subterranean darkness, carrying with them fear, injustice, and a flickering ember of hope for a tomorrow that might, perhaps, be less cruel. But in my heart, I knew that tomorrow was still a long way off. A very long way. The path to the rat elders' meeting place was no easy trek. It lay deep within the city's most ancient sewer section, a maze that even a rat as familiar with the terrain as myself had to navigate a few times before finding the correct passage. The air here was thick with the smell of moss and damp earth, a welcome change from the overwhelming stench of death in the areas closer to the surface. That, in its own way, offered some comfort. At least here, the Black Death didn't seem to have made its presence so forcefully felt. Grayfur stuck close to my heels, his small eyes darting around, both frightened and curious at the dark corridors and strange echoes vile nausea from afar. Occasionally, other rats, a permanent residents of this district, would poke their heads out from wall crevices, eyeing us with suspicion. I merely sniffed a cursory greeting. This was no time for social niceties. At last, we reached a large sewer chamber, perhaps once an old water cistern. In the center, on a raised mound of dry earth, a few old rats were huddled together. They were the core members of the Council of Elders, seasoned survivors, bearing the scars of time and countless struggles for existence. Their fur was faded to a silver, gray, their whiskers long and drooping, but their eyes still held a surprising sharpness. Squeak the first, the oldest rat, identifiable by a missing ear tip, spoke. His voice was as hoarse as the grinding of a millstone. What brings you here? And with a youngling in tow. He glanced at Grayfur, who was cowering behind my legs. I bowed my head respectfully, though I held little reverence for this slow, moving, conservative council. Revered Elder One, Ear, the situation above ground is dire. The two-leggeds have begun a new hunt, more brutal than before. They blame us for the Black Death. Another elderly female rat, known applica sales by the name of Old Mother Dim, eyes, snorted contemptuously. Is that anything new? Those fools are always the same. Let anything bad happen, and we're the ones to take the fall. This time is different, honored mother, I insisted. The plague spreads murderously fast. Our kind are dying in droves. Even a previously safe areas are no longer so. And that priest in the market, he's inciting the mob. I recounted what I had witnessed and heard. The faces of the elders grew more somber. Even the oldest among them couldn't hide the worry in their eyes. Elder One, Ear stroked his silver whiskers. So what would you have us do, Squeak? We are only rats. We cannot fight an entire city gone mad. I don't expect us to fight, replied. I expect a plan. A way to survive. Perhaps we should seek a new hiding place, further away, deeper underground. Or try to find a way to prove our innocence. My last suggestion seemed to make a few of the elders chuckle, a dry, mirthless sound. Prove our innocence. Old Mother Dim. I snorted again. And how do you propose to do that? Squeak. Write a letter to the Pope. Or send a rat delegation to persuade the Duke. Don't be knave. To the two-leggeds, we are born guilty. The harsh truth in her words made my spirit sink. But I couldn't give up. So we just sit here and wait to die. Wait until they find this place and burn us all alive. Another rat, a bit younger than the elders but with a reputation for quick thinking, named Whisker Slick, spoke up. He was known as an opportunist, often proposing bold, if not always practical, ideas. I have an idea, Whisker Slick said, his eyes darting about. I've heard tales of a land to the south, beyond the hills. They say the air there is clean, the land fertile, and most importantly, not many humans. A true promised land for our kind. Rumors. Elder One ear raised his remaining eyebrow. We cannot gamble the lives of our entire community on flimsy rumors, Whisker Slick, but honored elder. Whisker Slick countered. To stay here is also to wait for death. At least an exodus offers us a sliver of hope. I believe many of the younger rats would be willing to follow me. A debate erupted. The conservatives wanted to hold their ground, relying on their experience and knowledge of this sewer system to hide. The more radical faction, led by Whisker Slick, advocated for a perilous journey to a new land. Both ideas were fraught with their own risks and uncertainties. I stood there, listening, feeling an ever-growing sense of helplessness. This council of elders, instead of providing a unified solution, was becoming divided by conflicting opinions. And while they argued, time was not waiting. The two-leggeds were still hunting above. The plague was still spreading. Grayfur nuzzled my leg, perhaps sensing the tension in the air. I gently stroked his soft fur, trying to find some measure of calm. Squeak. Elder One, ear suddenly called my name, cutting through my thoughts. You are an intelligent rat. You have traveled widely, seen much. What is your opinion? All eyes turned to me. A sudden weight of responsibility settled on my scrawny shoulders. I was no leader, no prophet. I was just a rat trying to survive, like all the others here. I took a deep breath. Honored elders, I began, trying to keep my voice steady. Both options have their merits and their own significant risks. Staying here might be safe for a short while, but if the humans find us, we'll have no escape. An exodus to a new land is full of unknowns, but if successful, it could be a new beginning for our kind. I paused, looking around at the expectant faces. However, I think we are overlooking a crucial element. The truth. We are not the cause of the Black Death. We are its victims too. And so, instead of just running or hiding, is there not something we can do to show the two-leggeds this? Another round of laughter, louder this time. Even Whisker Slick smirked, still clinging to that fantasy squeak. Old Mother Dim, I said, her voice laced with pity. How? Do you plan to speak to them in their own tongue? I don't know, I admitted, feeling a flush of embarrassment at my own naivety. But there must be some way, perhaps not to make them love us, but at least to stop them from seeing us as a harbingers of doom. No one replied. Silence enveloped the chamber. It seemed my idea was too far-fetched, too unrealistic for these minds accustomed to a life of hiding and instinctual survival. Finally, Elder One, ear sighed. We will consider this further, Squeak. But for now, safety is the priority. Find a discreet place in this area to stay put, and keep a close eye on that youngling. The meeting ended without any clear decision. I felt a surge of disappointment. The council of elders, from whom I had hoped for a spark of guidance, seemed as helpless as I was. I led Grayfur away from the large chamber, finding a smaller, less frequented passage. Whisker Slick and a few other young rats were huddled in a corner, whispering conspiratorially. Perhaps they were planning their own departure. I didn't care. Right now, I just wanted a quiet place to think, and to find something for Grayfur to eat, because whatever the council decided, whether Whisker Slick headed south or not, my own struggle for survival, and that of this little mouse, had to continue. Day by day, hour by hour, minute by minute. Don't worry, Grayfur. I sniffed, trying to sound strong. I won't let you starve, and I won't let those stupid two-leggeds decide our fate so easily. A promise I wasn't even sure I could keep. But in this chaotic and unjust world, sometimes a hollow promise was the only thing that kept you going. The following days passed in a state of suffocating tension. The relatively fresh air in the deep sewers of the council's domain couldn't dispel the haunting knowledge of what was unfolding above ground. Rumors of the rat extermination campaign spread like wildfire, and occasionally, a few terrified survivors would find their way down here, bringing horrifying tales of new traps, brutal poisons, and human fury. The Council of Elders still hadn't reached a final decision. They met endlessly, argued ceaselessly, but the result was always a resounding 0. Meanwhile, Whisker Slick and his group had secretly departed, taking a significant number of young rats and pregnant females with them, leaving behind the warnings and contempt of the conservative faction. I didn't judge Whisker Slick. In these circumstances, everyone had the right to choose their own path to survival, no matter how risky. As for me, I couldn't sit still. My inherent curiosity, or rather, my ingrained habit of meddling in others' affairs, resurfaced. I needed to know what was really happening. This Black Death, was it truly all our doing? Or was there something else, some truth that the two-leggeds were deliberately hiding, or were simply too ignorant to realize? I decided to return to the areas near the surface, despite the danger. Grafer, after a few days under my care, seemed a little stronger. He was still timid, but less afraid of me. I instructed him to stay in a hidden spot, promising to bring back food. His worried eyes made me feel a twinge of guilt, but I knew I had to go. This time, my target wasn't the market, but the area near the makeshift plague hospital. They had recently erected a place where, by rat logic, there would surely be more clues about the disease. Of course, it was also the most dangerous place, crawling with physicians and guards. I moved with extreme caution, using the darkness and narrow sewer passages that only a rat of my size could navigate. The acrid smell of disinfectant assaulted my nostrils, a scent I detested. It masked all other odors, significantly dulling my sense of smell. After much slinking and squeezing, I found a crack in the wall of a dilapidated building overlooking the backyard of the plague hospital. The scene there was even more horrific than at the market. Human bodies were piled like garzi ungo, waiting to be carted away for burial if they still had enough people and enough ground to bury them. Moans and cries of agony drifted from within the makeshift tents, and the black-robed figures of the physicians moved about like carrion crows. I hid behind the wall, trying not to make a sound. My heart hammered against my ribs, not just from fear, but from an indescribable tension. I felt like an unwilling spy on a critical mission no one had assigned. Suddenly, a group of men, looking different from the usual physicians, entered the yard. They weren't wearing black robes, but more practical, though dirt-stained, attire. They carried strange instruments I'd never seen before: glass vials, tiny knives, and notebooks. They looked like researchers, or at least, individuals with a bit more sense than the fanatical crowds outside. They approached a fresh pile of corpses, carefully examining each body, noting the buboes, the signs of sickness. One of them, apparently the leader, kept giving orders and scribbling in his notebook. I strained my ears, trying to catch snippets of their conversation. Their voices were low and hushed, but in the deathly stillness, I could still make out a few words. This specimen seems different. Not entirely consistent with what we recorded in Marseille. Terrifying rate of spread environmental factors. A strange chemical found in the water supply near the tanneries thou. Strange chemical. Water supply. Tanneries. Those words caught my attention. The tanneries, I knew where they were. A horribly stinking place where they treated animal hides with all sorts of noxious chemicals. The wastewater from there flowed directly into the river, and many poor folks still used river water for their daily needs. Could there be a connection? I tried to memorize every detail, every frown, every gesture of these men. They took samples from the buboes, from the blood of the sick, carefully placing them in vials. Then, one of them let out a soft exclamation. "Look at this. In the pus from this patient, there are tiny, unidentifiable crystals. I've never seen this in plague samples before." The others crowded around. They spoke excitedly, scientific terms I presumed, flying back and forth. I didn't understand everything, but I understood one thing: they suspected something other than the usual bubonic plague, something possibly linked to chemicals, to environmental pollution. My heart beat faster. This was it. This could be a clue. proof that it wasn't all our fault, the rats. Perhaps we were just one part of a much more complex picture, a picture that human greed and ignorance had helped to paint. And so, I decided I had to go to the tanneries. I had to see for myself what this strange chemical was. It was a crazy idea. The tanneries were an extremely dangerous place, not just because of the toxic chemicals, but also because they were heavily guarded by dogs. But I couldn't ignore this lead. Just as I was about to retreat, disaster struck. A feral cat, huge and ferocious, appeared out of nowhere, lunging straight for the crack in the wall where I was hiding. Perhaps it had scented me earlier. Damn it. I barely had time for an internal yelp before scrambling back. The cat managed to thrust a sharp clawed paw into the opening, raking wildly. I felt a searing scratch across my back. Luckily, the gap was too narrow for it to squeeze through. I fled, not daring to look back. The cat's frustrated snarls echoed behind me. My heart felt like it would burst from my chest. A lesson learned the hard way: never let your guard down, not even when you're engrossed in investigation. Only when I had run a safe distance did I dare to stop and catch my breath. The scratch on my back still throbbed, but the physical pain couldn't overshadow the excitement palavras in my chest. I had a lead, a new objective. No matter how dangerous, I had to find out the truth. For myself, for Grafer, and for my entire maligned species. Returning to my temporary haven with Grafer, I felt an overwhelming exhaustion, yet my mind was unusually alert. The cat's scratch wasn't too deep, just a reminder of the ever-present danger. More important was what I had heard. Strange chemical, water supply, tanneries. Disparate pieces of a puzzle began to form in my mind. Grafer was overjoyed to see me return, nuzzling against me, sniffing at my wound. I shared what little food I had managed to scavenge on the way back, a few spilled grains and a plump grub. Watching him eat with gusto, I felt a rare flicker of warmth. After Grafer had fallen asleep, I couldn't rest. The words of those researchers haunted me. I needed more information. But where could one find information in this subterranean world? Then I remembered the library. That was the name I and a few other intellectual rats, those with the peculiar hobby of collecting scraps of paper discarded by humans, had given to an old, relatively dry corner of the sewer. There, we hoarded our precious documents, torn newspaper fragments, ripped pages from books, crumpled advertisements, even discarded love letters. To you two-leggeds, it was just trash. But to us, it was a treasure trove of knowledge, a window into your world. I decided to visit the library. Perhaps, amidst that jumble of paper, there would be some clue about the strange chemical, or the tanneries. The library wasn't far from my current spot, just a few twists and turns away. It was as quiet as usual. A few other bookworm rats were diligently researching their latest finds. They looked up to greet me, then returned to their work. I didn't disturb them, and began to rummage through the familiar piles of books. My eyes, accustomed to the dark, scanned quickly over the lines of script I had learned to recognize, though not fully comprehend after years of observing humans. I searched for keywords: tannery, chemicals, Arno River, sickness. Time passed. My eyes began to ache. Hope dwindled. Perhaps I had been too optimistic. How could a rat find evidence in a pile of garbage? Just as I was about to give up, a small, yellowed piece of paper, tucked under a stack of old newspapers, caught my attention. It was an advertisement, or rather, a notice seeking workers. The writing was faded, but I could still make out a few crucial lines. It spoke of a new tannery opened on the outskirts of the city, near the Arno River, seeking laborers to work with an improved leather dyeing process, using special compounds imported from the East, guaranteeing softer, more color-fast leather. Special compounds. Imported from the East. My heart leaped again. Could this be the strange chemical the researchers had mentioned? I carefully extracted the piece of paper, folded it neatly with my teeth, and hid it in a familiar wall crevice. This was a significant find. It didn't directly state that the chemical was toxic, but it provided a name, a specific location. The tannery of a man named. I squinted, trying to read the scrawled name at the bottom of the notice. It looked like Segnar Antonio. A name, a location, a suspicious chemical. The pieces were slowly starting to fit together. And so, I knew what I had to do next. I had to go to Segnar Antonio's tannery. I had to find out what that special compound really was. But that would be a mission even more perilous than observing the plague hospital. Tanneries were usually heavily guarded by dogs, and if those chemicals were indeed toxic, even breathing the air there could be lethal. I sighed. This rat's life, why did it always involve sticking my nose into dangerous places? Perhaps it was the price of curiosity, or for something larger that I myself didn't fully understand. I returned to where Grafer was sleeping, my mind a whirlwind of calculations. On one hand, there was my own safety and that of the little mouse who depended on me. On the other, the burning desire to find the truth, to clear my species' name, and perhaps to save this self-destructing city. A difficult choice. But I knew, whichever path I chose, fear would always be my uninvited companion. The decision was made. Though Grafer didn't seem pleased that I was about to disappear again, my determined gaze seemed to have convinced him. I found a safer hiding spot for him, in a deeper crevice of the library, where fewer rats frequented, and it seemed more secure. I also made sure to leave a small stash of food, the fruits of a hard night's foraging. The journey to Signor Antonio's tannery was a true ordeal. It was located on the edge of the city, near the banks of the Arno, an area that, even in peaceful times, wasn't particularly friendly to our kind. The guard dogs there were notoriously fierce, and the human children considered pelting rats with stones an elegant pastime. I traveled mostly at night, using the cover of darkness and secret pathways known only to a seasoned old rat like myself. The distinctive, foul odor of the tannery grew stronger as I approached a concoction of decomposing animal hides, lime, and a pungent, acrid chemical smell so offensive it made my nostrils burn. It was this very chemical stench that convinced me I was on the right track. Signor Antonio's tannery was a row of dilapidated buildings, their brick walls stained and crumbling, situated in isolation near the riverbank. A few flickering torches cast eerie, dancing shadows on the walls, and, as expected, the barking of guard dogs echoed from within. I spent nearly an hour lurking, observing, searching for a weak point in the tannery's security system. Finally, I discovered a small hole in the back wall, near where they dumped their waste. The smell here was even more horrendous, but it was the only way in. Holding my breath, I squeezed through the opening. Inside, the scene was worse than I had imagined. Huge animal hides hung from rafters, dripping some sort of liquid onto the slimy earth floor. Large wooden vats frothed with strangely colored solutions, pale blue, garish yellow, blood red. And the air was thick with chemical fumes, so much so that I found it difficult to breathe. I saw a few workers, even though it was quite late. Their faces were gaunt, their skin a sickly gray, and they coughed incessantly. They stirred the chemical vats, dipped the hides, then hauled them out to dry. They worked like automatons, without a word, without a smile. My heart pounded. This was where that special compound was being produced or used. But how to find proof? I couldn't read the labels on the vats, and I certainly couldn't drag a vat of chemicals back to the library as evidence. Suddenly, I spotted a corner of a storeroom that seemed less frequented. There, a few smaller, carefully sealed barrels were stacked, and beside them, a pile of tattered sacks printed with strange characters I guessed were from the east. Perhaps this was the raw material. I moved cautiously, avoiding the puddles of chemical waste on the floor. As I got closer, I smelled an even more pungent odor emanating from the sacks. I tried to gnaw off a small piece of one sack, hoping to bring it back to the library for the other, bookworm, rats to examine. Just then, one of the workers returned. He seemed to be looking for something. I quickly hid behind a pile of old hides. He approached the sacks, muttered a curse, and kicked one hard. A few white, crystalline particles spilled onto the floor. My eyes lit up. This was it. Small, white crystals, just like what the researchers had found in the pus of the sick. I couldn't be mistaken. I had to get some. And so, when the worker had left, I risked dashing out, quickly snatching a few of the crystals with my mouth, then beat a hasty retreat. My heart felt like it would explode. I knew I was carrying something incredibly dangerous, not just because it might be toxic, but because it was evidence that could change everything. I escaped the tannery unscathed, though my fur was now coated in that disgusting chemical smell. I ran all the way back to the library, not daring to stop. Part 2, the race against time and the cover-up of truth. When I brought those white crystals back to the library, the other, Bookworm. Rats were initially skeptical. They had never seen anything like it. But as I recounted what I'd heard at the plague hospital and witnessed at the tannery, their skepticism slowly turned to astonishment, then to alarm. An old rat, who had once lived near a human apothecary, carefully sniffed the crystals. "This stuff smells very strange," he said. "Not like any medicine I've ever known. It seems corrosive." We had no way to analyze these crystals. We were just rats. We had no laboratories, no instruments. We only had our observations, our hunches, and a vague belief that we were holding a piece of the truth. I felt a terrible helplessness. I had evidence in my paws, but how could I bring it to light? How could I let those two-leggeds know that it wasn't us, but these toxic chemicals that might be exacerbating the plague, or even be a different sickness running parallel to the Black Death? Over the next few days, I tried to communicate with humans. A crazy idea, I knew. I tried leaving the crystals near places where people passed, hoping someone would notice. I tried making strange noises near areas frequented by that group of researchers, but it was all in vain. To humans, a few white crystals were just dirt, and a rat making noise deserved to be bludgeoned to death. Despair began to creep in. Perhaps old Mother Dim Eyes was right. We couldn't change anything. The fate of rat kind was sealed. Just when I was about to give up, something unexpected happened. That day, I was wandering near the house of a poor artist. I knew he was poor because his leftovers were scarce and usually consisted of stale bread. I saw him sitting by his window, a brush in his hand, but his face was full of worry, and he wasn't painting at all. Suddenly, he took out a small piece of paper, hastily scribbled a few lines, then crumpled it up and threw it out the window with a sigh. The paper landed near where I was hiding. Curiosity flared again. I waited until I was sure no one was looking, then crept towards the crumpled paper. I carefully smoothed it out. The handwriting was messy, hard to read, but I recognized a few words. "Cannot bear it any longer. This deceit. Signor Antonio, the river is dying. Signor Antonio, the dying river." My heart pounded again. This artist, he knew something. Perhaps he, too, suspected the tannery. I had to do something. And so, I decided on an action even more reckless than breaking into the tannery. I would try to deliver my evidence to this artist. I returned to the library, retrieved the white crystals I had stored, along with the advertisement for Signor Antonio's tannery. I wrapped them carefully in a dry leaf. Then I went back to the artist's house. Waiting until nightfall, I climbed onto his windowsill. The window was slightly ajar. Inside, he was asleep, slumped over his worktable. I gently dropped the packet of evidence onto the table, right next to the paper he had written. Then I quickly vanished. That was all I could do. A final gamble. Would this artist be intelligent enough, brave enough, to understand my message? Or would he, too, dismiss it as a mere coincidence, a trick of fate? Part 3. The Faint Voice and the Legacy of Truth. The following days passed in an agonizing wait. I didn't dare go near the artist's house again, fearing I might spoil things. I could only hope. Meanwhile, the situation in the city grew worse. The rat extermination campaign was carried out with brutal efficiency. Many of my kind were killed. The Council of Elders remained helpless. Whisker Slick and his migrating group were never heard from again. No one knew if they had survived. Greyfur grew a little bigger each day, but the fear in his eyes never lessened. I tried my best to protect him, sharing every scrap of food I found. Then one day, as I was leading Greyfur to drink from a remaining puddle of rainwater, I heard a commotion from the direction of the main square. The two-leggeds were gathered in a large crowd, and it seemed something important was happening. I carefully climbed onto a nearby rooftop to observe. In the center of the square, a man was tied to a post. His clothes were tattered, his face bruised, and it was the poor artist. Beside him, a church official was loudly reading out a list of charges. I couldn't hear everything, but I caught words like blasphemy, inciting unrest, conspiracy against the city. And then, I heard Signor Antonio's name mentioned, along with accusations of poisoning the river. My heart stopped. The artist, he had acted. He had tried to expose the truth, but the crowd below showed him no support. They jeered, cursed, and threw stones at him. It seemed they didn't believe, or didn't want to believe, his words. They were too accustomed to blaming rats, demons, God's punishment. A stark complex truth about human greed and negligence was apparently too difficult for them to accept. Signor Antonio was there too, standing with a few guards, a smug look on his face. He had undoubtedly used his money and power to silence the truth. I watched the artist being punished, perhaps burned at the stake, or hanged. I didn't want to see clearly, an unbearable pain and outrage in my heart. He had failed, and I had failed. The faint voice of truth had been drowned out by ignorance and fanaticism. I led Grayfer away, unable to bear the sight any longer. This world, it had no place for truth, no place for justice, at least not for the powerless like that artist, and like us rats. In the days that followed, the Black Death continued its rampage. But something had changed, however subtly. People began to whisper rumors about Signor Antonio's tannery, about the polluted water. A few researchers, perhaps the group I had seen at the hospital, began to investigate more discreetly. Then one day, Signor Antonio's tannery suddenly closed down. It was said he had fallen ill and died mysteriously. Or perhaps he had fled. No one knew for sure. The Black Death didn't disappear immediately. It lingered for some time, claiming countless more lives, but it seemed that in a few areas, the severity of the plague lessened somewhat after the tannery closed. Perhaps it was just a coincidence. Or perhaps the artist's actions and the evidence that a small rat like me had tried to bring forth had made some silent impact. Many years later, when the Black Death had receded, when Florence was slowly beginning to recover, I was an old rat. Grayfer, now a strong, healthy adult, had a family of his own. I still lived in the dark corners of the city, still gnawed on the leftovers of human civilization. You two-leggeds were still the same. Still noisy, still greedy, still prone to foolish mistakes. You had forgotten the horrors of the Black Death, or deliberately tried to. You still blamed things you didn't understand. And you still considered us, the rats, your enemies. But I no longer felt as much anger as before. Perhaps old age had made me more serene. Or perhaps I had found some small meaning in this life so full of injustice. I hadn't been able to change the world. I hadn't been able to make humans love rats. But I had tried. I had dared to be curious. I had dared to seek the truth. And perhaps, somewhere, my small actions had made a difference, however unknown. Before I breathed my last, in a familiar dark corner, I decided to leave a legacy. Not gold or jewels. For what would a rat do with such things? My legacy was this story. I would tell it to my grandchildren and instruct them to tell it to their own offspring, generation after generation. So they would know what dark times their ancestors had lived through. So they would know that we were not always the ones at fault. And so they would know that even the smallest, weakest creature has a right to be heard, a right to seek the truth. Who knows, perhaps one day in the distant future, when you two-leggeds have grown a little wiser, when you have learned to listen to different voices, the story of this old rat might be chanced upon by someone. And perhaps, just perhaps, you will understand. For now, if you don't mind, I think I see a rather fine piece of gorgonzola calling my name at the end of this sewer pipe. Or maybe it's just death. Hard to tell these days. Squeak. That's all. Many years later, when the Black Death had receded into the annals of memory, when Florence was slowly, painstakingly, beginning its convalescence, I, Squeak the First, had become an aged rat. Young Grayfer, as he once was, now a robust adult, had a family of his own. As for myself, I continued my existence, still concealed within the somber recesses of this city, still gnawing upon the remnants of what you humans have erected as civilization. Your humankind seemed largely unchanged, still clamorous and bustling, still harboring an insatiable avarice, still frequently reprising rather obtuse errors. You had forgotten, or perhaps willfully forgotten, the dread horrors of the Black Death. You still attributed blame to that which you could not comprehend. And you still, as a matter of course, regarded us, the rat kind, as your sworn adversaries. Yet, strangely enough, I no longer harbored as much indignation as before. Perhaps age had bestowed upon me a certain serenity, or perhaps I had discovered some modicum of meaning in this life so intrinsically replete with injustice. I had not been able to alter the world. I had not been able to make humans cherish rat kind, but I had endeavored. I had dared to nurture curiosity. I had dared to venture forth in search of truth. And perhaps, in some small measure, my humble actions had indeed wrought a difference. albeit a difference known to none. Before I relinquish my final breath in this familiar, tenebrous corner, I resolve to leave behind a legacy. Not of silver or gold, for what use would our kind have for such extravagances? My legacy is this very narrative. I shall recount it to my descendants, and enjoin them to relay it further to their own progeny, from this generation unto the next, so they might comprehend through what a dark epoch their forebears once navigated, so they might perceive that we were not invariably the party at fault, and so they might engrave upon their memories that even the most diminutive, the most fragile creature possesses the right to be heard, possesses the right to seek and to safeguard truth. Who can say, perhaps one day in some distant future, when your humankind has attained a somewhat higher plane of sapience, when you have acquired the faculty of listening to diverse voices, to differing perspectives, the chronicle of this old, aged rat might be chanced upon by some serendipitous soul, and perhaps just a faint glimmer of hope you will understand. For the present, however, if you have no objection, I believe I have just detected the aroma of a rather exquisite piece of gorgonzola, beckoning from the terminus of yonder sewer pipe. Or it could be merely death making his rounds. These days it is, admittedly, quite difficult to distinguish.
you.